Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first panel discussion of the Journalism in the Time of Crisis conference. I'm very happy to welcome a glittering panel of discussants for the next hour or so. What we're going to be talking about is framed as a conversation about the watchdog versus megaphone functions of journalists. In short, how have journalists balanced their responsibility to amplify public health directives? That would be the megaphone part of the equation. And their responsibility to challenge political leaders and public health officials. That would be the watchdog component of the job. I'm joined today by four panelists who will help us animate our discussion around this subject. There is Sherelle Evelyn, who is the managing editor of the Hill Times. There is Obi Anyadike of the New Humanitarian. Evan Solomon, familiar to many here in Canada as the host of CTV political programs and radio talk shows, and Aaron Derfel, who is a health and medical reporter with the Montreal Gazette. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in introducing these folks. Obi is an online journalist and editor with extensive experience covering conflict, aid, international development issues, and crises in Africa and the Global South. He's the senior editor, Africa, with the New Humanitarian. Most recently, he closely scrutinized widespread warnings that Africa is on the verge of a historic famine as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. Evan Solomon is a Canadian columnist, political journalist, and radio and television host. He's the host of the daily national radio program that's broadcast on many stations across the country. He's a writer with Maclean's Magazine. He's host of CTV's national political news programs, Power Play and Question Period. I doubt there is any significant figure over the course of the pandemic that he hasn't had an opportunity to interview on one of those platforms. I will just give a heads up that Evan actually has to leave us at 11:45 today to prep for his noon hour radio program. So thank you, Evan, for squeezing us in. Aaron Derfel is an award-winning healthcare reporter with the Montreal Gazette, specializing in investigative and narrative journalism in a 30-year career that has taken him across North America. He has reported extensively on the COVID-19 pandemic and produced a daily Twitter thread followed by tens of thousands of Canadians. A regular panelist on discussions about public health policy, he also teaches part-time at Concordia University. Among his writings in recent months were reports that laid bare the unthinkable tragedy unfolding in a West Island long-term care home, where a severely overstretched staff had largely abandoned residents of that facility, where nearly 40 people died. And Sherelle Evelyn is the managing editor at the Ottawa-based Hill Times. She's also been a national affairs panelist with CBC Radio's flagship current affairs program, The Current. Previously, Sherelle was an associate editor with The Wire Report, a reporter and online editor with the Prince George Citizen, and a freelance journalist with the Ottawa Citizen. Sherelle is also formerly the head of the Ottawa chapter of the Canadian Association of Journalists. This year, she has been writing and directing coverage of the COVID-19 crisis at the Hill Times, which, for those of you who aren't aware, it serves as a kind of a local news outlet for Parliament Hill and its community here in Ottawa. But of course, it has a national profile because of who happens to inhabit that community, namely the nation's political leaders. So again, welcome to all of you. And I think by beginning, I'm just going to ask each of you to describe, if you could, how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected your own reporting efforts over the course of the year, and your own jobs, and then lead by all means into your overview thoughts about the panel topic as well. So Sherelle, can we begin with you?
Sure, let's start with me. Yeah, so, as you mentioned, Randy, at the Hill Times, we cover Parliament Hill and the parliamentary precinct, those few blocks in Ottawa that encompass, where everything happens, like a small town, like a community newspaper, so to speak. So, back in March, on March 13th specifically, the House of Commons voted to adjourn for what was going to just be 5 weeks, just to let things kind of get under control, keep the MPs from being vectors of transmission for the virus. And when essentially your community shuts down, what do you do? And how do you then turn your attention to this massive national story when downtown Ottawa is a ghost town, essentially? I mean, shortly thereafter, after the House of Commons shut down, Ontario went into lockdown. So, all the other businesses and services that were downtown were also closed. Our office, we didn't have to close because as a newspaper media outlet, we're an essential service. But when everybody's gone anyways, you might as well work from home. You don't have, committee meetings to rush off to down the block. So that happened. But at the same time, you now had every single day, you had the Prime Minister was giving a press conference and media availability outside of Rideau Cottage. And you had people like the Chief Public Health Officer, Theresa Tam, and the Health Minister, and the Deputy Prime Minister, and all sorts of senior officials available every single day, and they were saying something. So what do? Do you just go, well, they're there, so we might as well talk to them or write down what they're saying? No, because, maybe because we at the Hill Times, our mandate, our niche is always to not really cover the day-to-day goings on, like you might see on your typical nightly news that gives you a rundown, well, here's what happened in politics today. It's more of, here's what they said and why it matters, or what the inside story is behind that, or behind the scenes, or just, giving the bigger picture from the get-go. So that's how we approached it to begin with. We went in and said, okay, what's the news? Why does it matter? And how are we going to hold people accountable for these massive decisions that they're making? And that's what we did. And, we took this fire hose of information, we synthesized it sometimes into certain things like, timelines in the paper, sidebars, infographics, but those were just kind of there next to, here's 1,200 words about what this all means, and why, people should care, and how it's going to affect, people's lives, and, policies and politics down the road. And at the end of the day, when people talk about public service journalism, accountability is public service journalism. So you can't hold somebody accountable simply by, holding up that megaphone. You have to dig into what it is exactly that they're saying, and move on from there. And I don't want to prattle on, so I'll leave it there. And
we'll get back to you. Thank you very much for your opening thoughts. And no doubt we'll circle back. I'm going to ask you too about the resources that you have available in your particular news organization to cover the pandemic, and of course all the other issues that are going on. We almost had an election yesterday, so thank you for that opening. Aaron, you're next on my screen to speak up, so could you give us a quick overview?
Okay, well, it's a pleasure to be here, actually quite an honor. So, this pandemic is challenging all journalists in ways we could never have imagined. And in my case, that's certainly true. So one of the things that I've started that I could never have foreseen, and I basically stumbled into it, was my decision to write a daily Twitter thread of 10 to 20 tweets, something that I post every night. This is in addition to my regular journalism. So Randy, just before you were mentioning that my story, a few stories actually that I've written about the Résidence Heron in Dorval, Montreal. So what happened here is that I would say sometime in March, and I realized that what could I do? How could I contribute as a reporter? And this is something about just the unpredictable nature of the pandemic. It turned out that, at least in the first wave, Montreal had become the epicenter of the pandemic, not only in Quebec, but across the country. And there were thousands of deaths. In fact, Quebec has reported more than 6,000 deaths to date, by far the greatest number of any of the provinces. So, so I found myself in this inferno, if you will. And I realized that in order to stay on top of things, I feared that I was missing. I feared I might miss a story. In fact, I still fear I'm missing the story. So from almost a methodical point of view, or methodological point of view, rather, I felt that the only way to report on this pandemic accurately was to cover it every day, every single day, including on weekends and on vacation. And the way to do that is through my Twitter thread. And I couldn't have foreseen the response. Thousands of people have joined it. Diplomats, politicians, everyday people, epidemiologists. As a result of this thread, and this has been just a wonderful development, I've made contacts with a range of professionals, geneticists, epidemiologists, and I benefited from a form of crowdsourcing because there are hundreds of people who are following the thread and who keep me abreast of the latest developments in their neighborhood in the province. Now, what could I do that was different? And I felt that it wasn't being done. That there were these reports, but nothing every day, and that's what I could do. And I saw that there was these phenomenal journalists that you have participating in the conference, Helen Branswell, she and Ed Young. So, Helen of Stat News was, I think, one of the first journalists to sound the alarm about the pandemic very, very early on, I think in January. And Ed Young has done just tremendous work. What could I do? What could I bring to this? What I could do is just report on my neighborhood. And it turned out that my neighborhood was the epicenter of the pandemic. And it's as if, in retrospect, I've been on this beat for 22 years. I feel that I had been in training for this moment inadvertently for all these years. I had been writing about hospital outbreaks and epidemics in the community, epidemics like gastro or sometimes the measles. And so when the pandemic hit, unlike perhaps some other journalists who are on the health beat, it was not so foreign or alien to me. And so I felt that what I could do was just cover my neighborhood. And ironically, for me, it's local journalism, but this is a global issue, and the themes that have arisen are universal. Now, in following, the mandate I've given myself is to follow where the pandemic is moving geographically in the city. And it became clear at one point, it was moving into low-income areas with many racialized communities. Well, that was interesting. This is something that we could not have necessarily foreseen. And then what I started to do is you're reading about what's going on in jurisdictions around the world. People are making all kinds of comparisons, and so I was drawn to the best practices and reading about the worst practices, reading about the response in the United States versus the response in South Korea, and so I would say, I guess in the middle of the first wave in Quebec, the premier of the province, François Legault, he was holding daily news conferences at 1 p.m. and giving people an update on the situation. And he what he did is he had announced these arbitrary dates, what appeared to me arbitrary dates, to reopen Quebec, even though the number of hospitalizations was going up and the number of cases, and there were outbreaks all over the place. That struck me as odd. So, I would write about that. In writing about that and pointing out that there's no other jurisdiction in the world that was using his criterion to reopen. And the criterion he used was, he cited a so-called stabilization of deaths outside of the nursing homes. No other jurisdiction in the world, not even the White House, had cited that as a criterion to reopen. And I recall that he pulled out a graphic and to show this, a chart. So naturally, I wrote about this, and in writing and raising questions about this, you're challenging the politician. And it soon became apparent that he didn't really like my coverage. He was reading me. He acknowledged he was reading my Twitter threads as well. But then he started to single me out for criticism, and I guess that dovetails with the theme that half of the theme of this panel discussion, which is the megaphone versus the watchdog role. And I've had to balance the two as I've focused very methodically every day on where the pandemic is moving, in the province.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. That's I'm certainly going to follow up on the sort of tit for tat discussions, I guess you could say, you've had with the Premier over the months. It's been very interesting. Thank you for that quick overview. Obi, I wonder if you can give us a sense of your perspective on this.
Right. So, I mean, I'm with the New Humanitarian, which is a humanitarian news service. We try and look at both the aid response, or the response of the aid system, and how disaster and crisis affects people. So, in a sense, this was kind of when COVID kind of hit. I'm based in Nairobi, and I'm concerned with the African continent, and we're kind of a globalization's periphery. So it was a kind of like a phony war. Our first cases weren't until March, and we could see this spreading in other regions. So we're kind of waiting with bated breath for it to hit here. And when it did, we had the same kind of run on the toilet papers and everything else in the supermarkets. But for us, I mean, or for the New Humanitarian, the interest was, how does a multi-billion-dollar aid industry respond to something like this? I mean, the impact on people was not immediate at all. And that's another conversation, that infection rates and death rates have remained relatively low on this continent, which is interesting in terms of the dynamic of the coverage. But I mean, the idea of the aid industry is that it's meant to stay and protect, and yet they could potentially be vectors for COVID. Most of the international staff were based in Europe and America, etc., where COVID had already hit. So it was kind of interesting in terms of how they were having to adopt COVID protocols, which was having a distinct impact on beneficiaries that are meant to help. So that was kind of interesting. So the initial story was really about how this was impacting the aid industry rather than the people who were most vulnerable. I mean, immediately there were coverage challenges for me. I mean, the inability to get out into the field was frustrating. Obviously, you have a duty of care towards your freelancers, so that was also another challenge to make sure everybody socially distanced as best as possible to keep safe. And obviously, any risky travel was ruled out. So how now do we handle our regular reporting? I mean, for me, the key issue was to try and interrogate some of the perceptions that were formed or manufactured outside the continent. Africa is not homogenized in any way. Each country is very, very different. In most countries, the infection rates was very low. The death rates were low as well, as I said. So it was much more an economic impact. So it was much more what the lockdown was doing to local economies. And that was a kind of an interesting dimension to report on, but also to look at more alternative ways of tackling this. You know, African governments, again, I'm making a huge generalization, but were very quick to lock down. Part of the reason was health systems were quite fragile. So they impose quite stringent measures, which seems to have worked in slowing the spread of infection, but it's had a serious knock-on effect in terms of household incomes. So to try and report on that, to try and look at alternatives, to raise ideas around maybe, and quite realistically, the pandemic on this continent is different in its impact and effect to the rest of or other regions, with the exception of, to other regions. So to try and interrogate some of those issues was what I thought was kind of a valuable role to play. I think I'll end there.
Okay, thank you for that introductory overview. Much appreciated. Evan Solomon, please weigh in. Yes, you've unmuted and join us.
Thanks, Randy. And like Aaron, it's great to listen and to be part of this. Aaron's stuff is unbelievable, just for the record. Aaron, just some of the best reporting, I think, in Canada in the last year. It's been important. It's been really a hallmark of what great journalism. So just for me, like I've loved your reporting. So I just want to say phenomenal. That's what it's all about. You take a situation and the particular is the universal, and it's been so. Just that was a great thing for me to be on here, and of course I know Sherelle and her great work, and it will be nice to meet you. Look, all of us know in any crisis, there is this urge, whether it's a war or whether it's a health crisis like a pandemic. There's this sense that you have to join up and unify against the common enemy. And journalists instantly get co-opted in this sense that you better join in this united front, and you're in this kind of partnership with the common cause. And it's an incredibly dangerous moment for journalists who have to guard against that. We see it in our parliament, which I cover. You know, my front step is the parliament, like Sherelle and I do that. And, you know, they try to substitute a crisis as if a crisis and the democratic check and balance systems and the role of the media and the opposition somehow are expendable in a crisis. Oh, let's delay that. Let's suspend that because, you know, things are going, and they'll say things, well, everything's going so fast. There's money, we're in such an urgent situation. And it's really at those moments where all of us have to kind of take a deep breath and just do the job. Accountability never goes away in a crisis, in a war, in a pandemic. Facts don't disappear. Oversight and transparency and the fundamental job that we do, in fact, becomes more important. I always say to my team that I work with, as events go faster, you've got to go slower. Don't get breathless. Just stop. What's the issue? What matters to people? What's the accountability question? And we are living in a time where politicians have weaponized distrust as a form of politicking. And they've used the media as if, especially in the US, that the media is somehow the enemy of the people, which is an old kind of Ibsen idea that the state somehow can't sustain questioning, or it's you're not doing your job, you're an enemy, and or you're not all in it. So, you know, this dichotomy of Watchdog and Megaphone in some ways is important, but in some ways it's a descriptive thing that doesn't, you're always a watchdog. And being a watchdog is being a megaphone as well. You're being a megaphone to transparency. You're being a megaphone to accountability. You're being a megaphone, you know, the job is, you know, it's not oppositional for the sake of oppositional. It's it's accountable, because that's our job. And increasingly on social media, it's a very unpopular thing. For me, I'm sure for everybody here, politicians attack you, people, every single day. I'm a mouthpiece of the liberals, and then I'm a mouthpiece of the conservatives, and then I'm a doesn't matter. Because unless you are, especially in this day and age, echoing exactly what someone says, you've somehow become bought by a partisan. And all that is just signal to noise ratio. And our job is really to tell stories that affect people, to be fearlessly accountable, and to just adhere to our principles more than ever as the winds are howling. And I would just say finally, before I stop, in a pandemic, we're spending more money faster than we've ever done. More people are dying. If you look at what Aaron's done, you talk about the death rate in a place like Quebec, these numbers. And the thing about a crisis is abstraction is the enemy of journalism and the friend of politicians. Statistics, abstraction, desensitization. When we say, 9,000 people have died, 10,000, just do the math what that means, how many Canadians are dying every single day. That means right now someone died. Like in the time of this conference, this hour, there's a good chance a Canadian died from COVID just now, because that's how the numbers work. If you just crunch the 9,000, or Aaron would know the number, under 10,000, but in 6 months, because people didn't really start dying in long-term care homes till, really March. You're talking about every couple of hours, a Canadian's dying from a disease. And around the world, in America, it's even astronomical. So to avoid the abstraction, so we've got to really track the money being spent, the deaths that are happening on a daily basis, which is why human stories, accountability, it just becomes more important. And I really think this is the moment where we not just, and being accountable is two things. It's facts, and it's awakening people to arouse their compassion and their concern. And journalism's biggest challenges, especially in an oversaturated environment, is people just stop caring. It's shocking. The U.S. is very that people just don't give a damn. You just say, oh yeah, well, I don't know, I don't wear a mask. 10,000 people. It's mostly old people. Like, when did that happen? And there is a collective callousness just because you're inundated with so much crap. And reawakening empathy, reawakening concern, that's part of our job as much as delivering facts and accountability. That's why, again, I'll just go back to what Aaron, his stories are so particular, so human, that it's bloody hard not to feel it. So the facts and the emotions combined with real journalism. And I think that's where it really matters.
Okay, thanks, Evan. Much appreciated. I'm going to narrow in a little bit on the accountability function. You've all mentioned it as something that, despite the need for journalists to obviously amplify the public health guidelines and inform people about what's necessary to stay safe and so forth, that function has not abated, and that it remains kind of central to what we do. But this is all happening at a pace that is unprecedented in many ways. Evan, you just talked about the amount of money being spent and the decisions being made from day to day and week to week, in many cases about what to do. In some ways, just as a human being, I feel for the decision makers who have to respond to this unprecedented situation. Maybe they didn't do enough preparation in advance. Maybe they shortchanged public health budgets. But nevertheless, here we are in the midst of this almost impossible situation. And yet we want to hold people accountable. How do we balance our need to be critical with a recognition that even the politicians and even the public health experts are scrambling to figure out what to do? And Sherelle, maybe I'll start with you.
I don't know if I would say that, there is a need for, it's going to sound callous. I don't know if I'd say there's a need for that balance. I mean, the stories for the most part and the reporting that's being done, it's not for the most part, it's not personal attacks against the decision makers. You're scrutinizing and criticizing the decisions that they've made. Yes, everybody is under an immense amount of stress. Everyone's resources are strained, but questioning why somebody made the choice that they did does not mean that you're, telling a story that says, so-and-so is a horrible human being because they made this choice. I mean, their choices have a real significant impact on people's lives. And you have to be able to look at them and say, okay, you made this choice. This is the fallout, or this is the potential fallout. Tell us why you did it, and tell us why we should think that this was the best decision to be made with the information that you had. I mean, if we look back at, in the spring or early summer, where people were talking about masks and Dr. Cam was saying, well, masks aren't, the science hasn't settled, masks might not necessarily be the best way, and people were getting really angry. But that doesn't mean that the question should not be asked as to, well, okay, well, you said this at this time and now you're saying this. Give them a space to explain themselves, give them a space to tell us what the information is, provide the data. If we don't ask for it, we're not going to get that information. So just because a decision has been made doesn't mean that, they get off scot-free because the science has changed. We are creating the record as we go.
Right.
So just because information now says X doesn't mean that just because it said Y, 2-3 weeks ago, 3 months ago, doesn't mean that you don't have to answer for what changed in that amount of time.
Right. You raise a good example with the mask issue. Obviously, journalists were reporting what was being said early in the pandemic about that particular way of, stemming the spread. And then the advice evolved over the course of weeks and months, and that was a kind of a clear example of something that actually Ed Young mentioned in his talk earlier as an example of where there needed to be a lot of scrutiny around that particular issue. I'll just move along here. Obi, do you want to weigh in on how do you keep people accountable in this challenging environment?
I think Evan raised a good point that we can do both. I think what's interesting, there's a distinct difference, it seems, from the kind of media reporting in the US or in the global north and the global south. I think particularly where I sit, there's a history of kind of public service kind of reporting. And I think that's happened. People kind of fall in quite naturally to a certain extent with this megaphone approach, partly because the horror is an unregulated social media. Legacy media here is quite weak to a certain degree. It's been undermined by fall in ad revenue, etc. And legacy titles are under pressure. And there's a very vivid and very loud social media world where you have these conspiracy theories thrown around. So I think in a sense, the media sees their role as trying to play a careful balancing role in this kind of pandemic. And secondly, in this sort of public sort of service function, there's very little questioning about vaccinations and take your polio jab. And even during the Ebola crisis in the few countries where that was an issue, governments were very quick to jump on these conspiracy theories. And I think that was a positive attitude taken. And I think people appreciated that. Because below the surface, there's some nutters out there, as there are globally. So I think the media, the mainstream legacy media sees their role as trying to correct the public record to a certain degree.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Aaron.
Okay, so this issue of accountability, I think it often arises just from the subject matter, from what you're covering. So you recall early in the pandemic, this has now become a well-studied story, the Diamond Princess, the Canadians, and there were others who were stranded on that ship for, they were supposed to be 14 days, but it was longer. And it turned out that the ship had become an incubator for the virus. So I was tracking, I was speaking to a couple from Montreal who were on the ship, and they, initially it was understood, you know, you had to wait and they would tough it out. But then they were complaining to me that they were not getting information. They weren't getting information from the Japanese, but they started to criticize Canadian authorities, that they were not getting information from the Canadian embassy. And they were criticizing Canadian response. They were supposed to be repatriated. So, you know, I started to write about that, right? I mean, it comes with the territory of, you know, why was Canada waiting, and Canada was responding after the US. The US had taken the decision to repatriate US citizens from the ship earlier, and then Canada belatedly. So, you know, that occurs with the, you know, speaking to your sources, right? Picking up on something that Evan said that I found really surprising. In Quebec, early in the pandemic, you know, the premier was giving his news conferences and there was it struck me as quite odd as he and his entourage were leaving the press room. All the camera operators in the hallway just burst into spontaneous applause. You know, why were they doing that? I couldn't understand why they were applauding the premier. Yes, you know, early on there was this feeling that, you know, that we're all in this together. We must be united. Ça va bien aller. This solidarity. We must maintain solidarity. So for me, at least in Quebec, I think the turning point came when, you know, I reported on what was going on at the Heron, and you saw, no, ça va pas bien aller, you know, that most of the staff had abandoned the residents who were lying in their own feces and who were dehydrated, and that came as a big shock. I think for me at least, it marked a turning point, right? That it's okay as journalists to move away from purely public service journalism to asking tough questions. And I think that that's when things changed, and we saw a lot more critical journalism, and certainly during the second wave, lots of journalists in Quebec are asking tougher questions, and I think that's just part of our function. You know, we will announce what the government, we will report on what the government is doing. When the government announces that there's this new pandemic alert system, green, yellow, orange, red, we'll report that. But then it's entirely appropriate to scrutinize this and to ask questions. You're announcing these color-coded alerts, but what are the numbers to back this up? When are you going to move to this? You know, what's justification to move from orange to red? And when you do move to red, what are you going to do? And are you going to shut down schools? So I think it's entirely within our purview as journalists to ask those tough questions. But I agree entirely with Evan in the sense that early on there was this strong sense that we had to rally behind our leaders, and that always, I as a journalist, I've never felt that I had to rally behind my leader. So that's that I found, you know, it was not a natural fit for me, and that's just who I am.
Okay, thanks very much. Evan, feel free to continue down the theme of accountability. I also have another question for you, which is that over the months you've probably interviewed any number of public health experts. You've talked to many politicians, I know, and I wonder about the way that you approach that balance on a very individual basis. I mean, some of these are people you probably know well, but there are public messages that need to be, shared to help citizens understand what they need to do. But at the same time, you've got someone in the chair that you need to grill. How do you balance that in the search for accountability?
Well, first of all, I agree with Sherelle. Our job is we're not governing. They have their job. We have to be responsible and fact-based, and we report on the news. But when journalists sort of decide we're going to join the priestly class and kind of hold hands and pretend we're sort of a deputized sheriff and we're part of governing, this is a terrible moment. We'll report on public messaging. I'm not an epidemiologist, so you know what I do? We have Dr. Sharkow, we have Dr. Bogosh. I want a doctor. Hey, is this the right thing to do? So the first thing is you go to experts who you can fact check, and those experts are doing that job anyway. It's built into the DNA of a good story that they're telling it. You don't have to say, well, we better tell. We're not elected to do that. Why? But we have to report on the story. That's the first thing. The second thing is memory is the enemy of governments and the friend of journalists. And in fast-moving events, people forget. So I'll give you some examples. The politicians are now out there with their, "Aw, shucks, we have to cancel Halloween." Nobody wants to cancel Halloween, and they're really good at it. And everyone's like, "Gosh, he's a real good guy. Gee, that premier's so great. Gosh, he really gets me." But if you forget that they didn't anticipate the second wave that every single doctor said, if you forget that the strategy here was rapid testing as the big tool before the vaccine, and that they completely screwed that up. If you forget that in the madly off in all directions that they did, some very good and some great things and some not great things, they found themselves in that. The fact that schools are reclosing because they didn't invest, some governments that cut schools, cut teachers, underpaid frontline workers, stop minimum wage from going up, the very policies that when the pandemic, now they're out there, these are our heroes, we need to give them more money. I can't believe long-term care homes are so bad after they were cutting long-term care homes, privatizing them, letting people, these are the very people accountable for the very problems. When you strip the system and it becomes vulnerable, it's very convenient to come in as the hero at the last minute with a cape on. But it's because politicians don't want people to have memory, which is the requirement of journalists. Let's just remember how we got here. You cannot have accountability without context, and context requires memory. And that's why journalists who have a beat, who have been doing their jobs, have to bring those questions in. Politicians hate that, like, "Hey, why are you bringing up that? It's in a new situation." That's just straight up BS, okay? The truth is, accountability requires, because when the pandemic's over, they'll return to that. And, every politician, don't make no mistake, many of them they're all good people, they're decent human beings, they're in it to help Canadians, I understand that. But they are also here to survive and keep in power. And they're weaponizing a crisis for their own self-interest. So we've got to balance that. And the final thing I'll say, just to answer your question, Randy, I know a lot of these politicians, not buddies of mine, but look, I've probably been on Parliament Hill longer than most of these people, right? A lot of them are new. I've seen them come and go, and they come, the cycles are there. If you've been covering politics for 20 years, these guys are, they've been on Parliament Hill for 5 years. I mean, they don't know anything. But my job, and I talk to them on background, and I don't mean this because it's not a game, it's our democracy, and lives are at stake here. But I always tell them, it's not personal for me. but it's very much like, you know, playing hockey or football or soccer or whatever. When the whistle blows, I'm coming. I'm going to do my job. I am doing my job. I'm going to grill you on the facts. I'm going to make you accountable. Because that's my job. It's not personal. And Sherelle said it exactly right. After the interview, they're human beings. I don't wish them ill. I'm not going after their families. I'm not hitting below the belt, because guess what? There's so much material above the belt. We don't need to go below the belt. Above the belt is where the action is. And so I don't have any problem, you know, on someone on my program being as tough as I can be, not for the purpose of confrontation, because, you know, Obi will know, and everybody on this call will know, these politicians are all trained. They have a very elaborate scaffolding system of comms people who, before they go out, have trained them specifically to stay on message. So you know, they're coming with a Praetorian guard and say, this is how. So we have to get through that. And if we say, you know, and they do it insidiously, one question, one follow-up, no questions. We'll pick who's the questions. All these strategies that, oh, you followed up twice, that's so rude. Rude, why? Because you ran out of your talking points? We have to do our jobs, and they have to do theirs. I don't begrudge it. Good for them. They're going to have their comms and their team and their strategy and all that. But we just have to, it's not personal. Sherelle's exactly right. It's rigorous and impersonal, and we just have to continue to do our jobs. And I honestly have, when a politician comes back, oh, I can't believe it, you're such an asshole, or you are so rude. You know, I have to, and by the way, sometimes I blow it. No one's perfect, you know, no one's hitting 1,000. Sometimes I do an interview that maybe I was a little over the line, or, you know, I agree. And I often go back and forth with the politicians. Hey, I'm always there. If you think I was a bit of a dick, okay, I get it. And guilty as charged. By the same token, our team, are the questions fair? Are they what's needed? Are they in the service of some kind of important, the people of Canada? And if so, you know, my job is to go as hard as I can to get that answer. And if I get it, great. And if they're offended and it was fair, not dirty, I could really care less. That's not, my job is not to do their job. My job is to get answers.
Okay, thanks. There's been a thread of this throughout a number of the comments. I think both Obi and Sherelle talked about this. We're in a difficult moment in the history of journalism globally. Resources are tight. The ability to cover complex stories isn't what it was, you know, a few decades ago. And I'm wondering about, in that context, especially when governments have a number of the tools that Evan just referred to, getting access, getting answers, following stories in an in-depth fashion that is required when it's complex can be challenging. Obi, I wonder if you can start us talking about that challenge. In other words, how do you be a watchdog in an era when there are tremendous challenges just institutionally for journalism, you know, to perform that function?
Yeah, it's extremely hard. As I said, the legacy media is in trouble. It was never particularly robust to begin with. Politicians are past masters at deflection. They also can bury bad stories, and they can threaten and manipulate media, especially in regions of the world where politics is a little bit more bruising than other places. But I think what's interesting is perhaps that, you know, there's changes afoot. I think that for not talking about any specific countries, because as I said earlier, every country is different. But I think we're starting to see maybe, you know, a shift in models. I think we need to look at, you know, what model can work now. And I think increasingly we're accepting that whole idea of like philanthropy supported media to a certain degree, because it's so hard to make ends meet. I know in Canada, there's actually been government bailouts of the media. I think that would be very difficult in some contexts, because obviously that kind of flies in the face of the neutral position that journalists are meant to play. It's difficult, but I think, you know, that, you know, God bless the journalists who do go out there and challenge. I mean, obviously there's been huge issues around misappropriation of money. You know, suddenly there was a shed load of money landing, and how do you follow that, especially when media is kind of challenged to, you know, we're often jacks of all trades. We don't have specialized investigative journalists, and to a certain degree, that's kind of a bit thin on the ground. So to follow the money trail is a little bit hard. But, you know, I think politicians have to respond to and try and respond to those sort of broadsides that the media still do, you know, fire at them. But the problem is, I don't know about in the rest of the world. I think it's pretty much in the rest of the world as well. Politicians can be quite shameless. You can have them bang to rights. You can confront them with whatever lies they've uttered. You can confront them with, you know, suddenly they seem to have an awful lot more money than their salaries would suggest. But how do you pin them and hold their feet to the flame, to mix metaphors? Yeah, so those are just some of the challenges. There's many more, but I'll pause there.
Right. I'm going to give the others an opportunity to address this. I do want to acknowledge, I see a good question from Ivor Shapiro that is specifically directed at Obi. We'll get to that momentarily. I'm also aware that, Evan, you're fighting the time issue, because I know you've got just a short time left with us. But I'm going to turn to Sherelle to weigh on in this question of, in an era of tight resources, how we manage to follow stories in the way that we might like in our watchdog roles.
Yeah, I mean, at the Hill Times, I think we're in a particularly lucky and fortunate position. We're an independent company, and we've actually been growing in this time of shrinkage, if you will.
Yeah.
We have a newsroom of about 12 people, which is basically unheard of for a Hill specific bureau. But that doesn't mean that, you know, it makes it any easier to do what needs to be done. I mean, people right now are scattered to the wind, learning how to navigate the new environment that we were all in. It was incredibly stressful. I mean, how do you do your job that you're accustomed to doing, you know, in a noisy, boisterous newsroom or up on the Hill, you know, from the solitude of your own home? I haven't seen the majority of my coworkers in 7 months face to face. And that all, you know, ties into how you do your job and how you cover the news and bounce ideas off of each other. And just the very fact that Parliament had more or less shut down, that had a huge impact on how we do our jobs and some of the tools that we use to do our jobs. I mean, government offices, bureaucrats for the public service, they decided that things like ATIP officers, access to information officers, weren't essential. So you can't get documents, you know, papers on the order question, questions on the order paper, sorry, that MPs submit and get answered by the government. Those weren't being filed digitally with the Library of Parliament. So you had to find all kinds of workarounds to get information that was normally, if not readily available, at least accessible. So that all feeds into it. And then there's also the idea of, you know, how do you keep the doors open? Because everything has changed. Advertisers aren't advertising to the extent that they are, because their businesses have gone, you know, have shut down. So all of these things tie into, you know, how you do your jobs, not only keeping the mental health of your own reporters at front of line
Yeah.
and making sure that, you know, people aren't working 7 days a week like Aaron is doing, even though it seems like that was his own volition. But
I take it that's part of your role in at the Hill Times. You're commandeering the troops, basically. Sorry, more war metaphors.
yeah, that has to be part of it. You have to check in and say, you know, how are you doing?
Yeah.
Can you do this? And sometimes you have to push people and say, you know what, I know things are hard, but we need to get this done, and we need the stories to be done in a way that are useful and accurate and compelling. And there's also times where you say to people, take a holiday, just take a day off, take a week off, just leave, because we can't, you're no good to anybody and to our readership if you're entirely burnt out. So that all feeds into how you keep people accountable. You have to keep yourselves together.
Right. Thanks, Sherelle. I'm going to quickly move to Evan on this point, just because I know, Evan, you have to take off to do your show. If you can weigh in on the question of resources, and then I'll come back to Aaron.
Yeah, okay, just two things. This is a really difficult time for journalism, as we all know, but it's also a big opportunity. You know, journalism's perpetually in crisis for lots of reasons. The pandemic is the pandemic's been, in some sense, we've got more access to more people, but less access to revenue. So revenues have plummeted while audiences have gone up. So it's this kind of crazy conundrum, as we all know. There's three things I just quickly will say, and I want to first talk about what Obi said. I thought that was incredibly important, especially for us in Canada, to realize the relationships to governments, to legacy media, are totally different in the global South and the global North. And it's, especially when we have a borderless, you know, we're facing a world where, I don't want to get too sort of bonkers here, but the kind of Westphalian world from the Treaty of Westphalia in the 1600s, which really established a world based on respect for national borders and nationhood, is ending, because we're facing climate change and pandemics, and almost all the existential crises facing the world are borderless crises. And the mechanisms that we have that were post-war mechanisms, small L liberal mechanisms like the United Nations, the global trade networks, those have collapsed because they've been either dysfunctional, they've been undermined by all sorts of international political reasons and distrust. So we have very weak mechanisms. So then you've got, for example, where Obi works, we have very little good information coming out of a lot of the global South for three reasons. One, our bureaus are all, we don't have our own journalists there from our organizations. We basically, all our foreign bureaus are shut. Two, the domestic difficulties within some of these countries, as Obi would know better than anybody, has made that situation really difficult to thrive and get journalism for political reasons, authoritarian reasons, economic reasons. So we're getting, you know, in an information world, we're getting massive asymmetric false information. The void is being filled by conspiracy theories that have been, as I say, weaponized by governments for self-interest. So I really just can't tell you, Obi, how much I appreciate just hearing that, because I really think in a world where we're trying to deal with global vectors on things, of crises like this, we're not getting great information. And that's a crisis of journalism, because it's an ecosystem. When foreign, like when the New York Times shows up in Mali, or when the New York Times or the CTV or CBC or BBC shows up in a country, they can put a story on the map that will actually feed local media and force governments to act. And there's an ecosystem. But when they pull out, it allows governments to avoid global scrutiny, and it makes it much more difficult on local media. So there's a whole knock-on consequence in the ecosystem. The second thing I'd quickly say is governments aren't the only thing that have become so sophisticated at muzzling media and getting their message out. And you know, that's their job. They're going to get more sophisticated. Social media platforms, the Facebooks and the Googles, have used a very bogus fig leaf to pretend they're technology platforms and not journalism. So they call themselves technology platforms, but to avoid any of the conventions that we all function under as journalists, well, they not just scoop up our stories because they're the best aggregators and amplifiers, but scoop up the very resources that we all depend on. And then they say, well, we're not journalists, but they actually are. And they have, and Zuckerberg's lack of responsibility on any form of journalism has been one of the colossal info crises and challenges for any kind of, not just journalism, but for democracy. And we have to deal with that too. And the answer to that is creativity. There are going to be entrepreneurs that will figure out how to aggregate eyeballs and tell. And I would just say the great innovation that I always think is a great story. When my kids were born, kids didn't read anymore. Reading was dead. Reading was dead. And then some single mother named J.K. Rowling, forget her current crisis for a second, wrote Harry Potter, and kids were reading like 1,000-page books. Why? Because it was a hell of a good story. I'm just telling you, technology is dangerous or great or whatever you make of it. A good story will cut through. A good story aggregates interest and is powerful. That's not changing. How those stories are told, where they're told, and the medium that they're told on, whether it's on wood like a newspaper or on a Zoom call but a good story is the most powerful journalistic weapon. And in this time of crisis, telling good stories, and it can be and Aaron's the best example. He looked in his neighborhood, he found a good story, and guess what? It happened. We literally have an example. So the young students out here, if a good story is still the gold for journalism and for democracy and for change. And it's all we've got. It is the sword you've got. And when you abandon that for some fancy trick, good luck, because it ain't gonna work.
Okay, thank you, Evan. I know you have to scoot.
Sorry, guys.
No, I really appreciate you swinging by. I hope you learn how to speak your mind when you get out of here.
No, it was enough. Thank you, guys. I really genuinely apologize that I got to go, but
thanks.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Okay, Aaron, I'm going to hand it back to you for some thoughts about that particular challenge. I know you've referred to it as well, about having both the time and the resources to pursue stories, and what your particular solution was in this case. But how challenging is it for a newsroom in this era to be able to confront a story of this magnitude?
The big question a lot of people have is, will this pandemic become an extinction event for newspapers in particular? And so the newspaper I work for, which is owned by Post Media, is receiving wage subsidies from the federal government. What will happen when those subsidies run out? Will some newspapers fold? Post Media early in the pandemic did close, I think, some weekly newspapers. Mm-hmm. And this threat is not going to go away. I've tried to respond to this in my own way, which is essentially to work for free. I mean, in addition to my day job, I do get paid, and that's subsidizing my Twitter thread, which actually requires hours and hours of work. So that's subsidizing it. If there's any silver lining, it's that people on Twitter are noticing, and they've decided to subscribe. Every chance I get, I will, write down the hashtag support local journalism.
Right.
And so I think that that what I found is people want quality. They want quality journalism, and if you give it to them, they will appreciate it. And I found that among some of my followers, that they've either resubscribed to the Montreal Gazette, yeah, or have decided to subscribe for the first time. So I'm doing my own part modestly, to raise the quality of journalism, and in so doing, spur interest in it, spur interest in supporting it.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Obi, I wonder if you've had an opportunity to look at the question that was posed. If not, I'm happy to read it.
Yeah, if you could, or if you could summarize it.
Yeah, I'll just read it. A question for Obi. In this discussion, the focus of the Canadian participants has been on public health tactics, alert levels, masks, spending on testing, and so on. But you've spoken about the broader picture of the impact of the pandemic, such as the impact of the economic decline on people's lives in Africa. When you read or watch media coverage from the global north, what do you observe about the range of the subject matter they address? To be specific, what are the gaps that you see? The issues that media in rich countries do not seem to be investigating with enough rigor and consistency.
Yeah, that's a great question, and obviously every media ecosystem is different, so it's difficult to generalize. I think the key difference, I think, is the politicization to a certain degree of the crisis that we see maybe in the global north. The issue of what Fauci is saying versus how Trump is responding, and that becomes a trope all on its own. I think from where I sit, that's not quite the same. I think we're dealing with more. I'm not significant, but I think we're dealing with some really difficult challenges around holding governments accountable. Yes, reporting on the local impact is also something that I think we can do better at, but increasingly we're beginning to see that. And then looking perhaps, because in a sense that this crisis, as I said, is less a health and more an economic issue. Maybe what's missing, and I'd like to see more of, is, so what do we do now? And I think it's trying to build back better, to use that kind of horrible phrase that, okay, we have a crisis, what happens next? Africa is going to take a massive hit, as the world will as well. But in terms of, a number of countries are already struggling. There's pre-existing issues around conflict, pre-existing issues around poverty as well, which the poverty issue for sure, and the development and downturns as a result of COVID are only going to get worse. How do we, what's the next step? How do we act either individually as a country or collectively as a region? I think the whole issue around social protection, and I think that's kind of shown the way, what a number of northern governments are kind of taken for granted, is that you can, in a sense, protect vulnerable populations. In a number of other regions, that has been something that wasn't possible politically, and perhaps until now. The whole issue of a welfare state was something that was, it was something that the donor governments perhaps would frown upon, even just in terms of, subsistence programs for farmers was something that, was a bit of a political hurdle to get over. I think we're now beginning to understand and accept that we really need to be able to preserve the most vulnerable members of our communities. And that has a knock-on effect in terms of what that means for education for girls, what that's going to mean in terms of micro businesses and restarting economies. So I think I'm doing a very, very general, and I think I've veered off the question now, but I think there's for in the north you have some particular issues which are shared, but I think we're in much of the global south, the vulnerability is so much worse, and I think that needs to be recognized.
Okay.
But that's not to say, I think in a sense that, there's always been this trope, that African governments are unable to cope, that the situation will degenerate into, I don't know, people falling, sick in the streets and, healthcare not being able to manage. But I think what we need to recognize is that a lot of governments have been dealing with significant public health crises for quite a while, and they're quite good at it. And I think that's an untold story, that in a sense, governments have responded within their means relatively well. So, you know, we've had the lockdowns, which had an impact, but in terms of people's standards of living, the governments have been kind. Governments have been, in a number of cases, have been aware of the need to lift as well. So we've had lockdowns and we've had easing, and in a sense that's allowed people to restart their businesses, and that's offered, you know, that's been a way out of what was getting to be quite a significant issue. Institutions have been weak, but we've also seen, you know, positive responses from CDC Africa, and we're starting to see a healthcare system that had been degraded for quite a while. We're beginning to see the significance of why you need a robust healthcare system. We've seen laboratories come online that weren't there before. So in a sense, there's been a knock-on effect, which has been, you know, quite positive. And I think we need to also flip some of the questions that we've seen. I mean, recently there've been a raft of stories of, why isn't Africa worse off as a result of COVID? And I think there was a very interesting review by Nanjela Nyabolo, who's based here in Kenya, saying that, we need to flip the script and not ask, why, it's not that, when the world suffers, Africa must suffer more. We need to flip the script and say, why has the West failed so badly? Or certain regions of the North failed so badly in simple things like wearing a damn mask. Right. Wherever you go, where I'm based in Nairobi, it's standard you wear a mask. I mean, that just seems pretty bloody obvious. But that hasn't been an issue. But so there's a number of tropes that I think we need to address. And I think I'm well aware I've spoken too long, so I'll pause.
No, thank you very much, and thank you, Ira Shapiro, for that question. We're down to about 4 minutes based on our schedule, which it simply leads me to invite each of you to wrap with anything that you that comes to mind sort of throughout the discussion, whether it's picking up on a thread that you wanted to make a point about, or some other subject that we haven't talked about. But the time is tight, so I'm going to keep you to about a minute. Sherelle, have you got further thoughts you wanted to just throw in there?
Sure, I'll just throw this in there as a final thought. As we talk about accountability and holding people accountable, I think that as journalists on a broad scale, we do a pretty good job of parsing what stories need to be told, depending on what the crisis is. I think when it comes to public health, there's been, as we've been talking about, there have been really clear delineations of, being a good watchdog. In other forums, not so much. I'm thinking about, the issues about systemic racism and police brutality. In a lot of those cases, the megaphone is often given to the wrong voice, and the level of scrutiny is put on the victim instead of it being flipped around. So I would just say, as a final, put that out there, think about that watchdog element and that accountability element, and make sure that you are applying the lens to the correct voice at the right time, because it's not always the same all the time.
Right. Thank you for that. Yeah, lots of evidence this year of all years for the truth of what you're describing. And Aaron, give you another moment.
I guess my final thoughts would be, I think we have to stay humble as journalists. What I mean by that is we have to listen more to our readers, to our sources, to the public. And when we screw up, as I have, we have to own up to it very quickly. And I'm aware too that the more hard-hitting your journalism will be, the more you open yourself up to scrutiny. But then you have to own that, and you have to be able to to defend your reporting. So I guess those would be my final thoughts, is just to really stay humble and to be open-minded.
Okay, thank you very much. And Obi, final thoughts, and that will really wrap us up.
Yeah, okay, I'll be quick. I think it's to worry about what this impact is going to have on media. I think there is some online revenue growth that we've seen in some countries, Nigeria, South Africa. I think we really need to think on this continent about how to renegotiate revenue share with Facebook and some of the big social media tech giants, and seeing, maybe, we need to, the continent needs to think collectively about how to do that. I think, and to the aid industry, I think, that I kind of, in a sense, report on, don't use people's crises as a way to fundraise. Have a bit more nuance in the messages you send.
Okay, thank you. I do like the positive note out of all of that, that maybe there are there's a growing recognition, I guess, of the value that journalism has demonstrated throughout this pandemic. And I think that probably includes both the watchdog function that's been so vital in shedding light on problems with the way that this pandemic has been handled, and with the tragedy that it has inflicted on so many people. And at the same time, I think also that that megaphone role, where we are actually a kind of a vital conveyor of information for experts and authorities, especially in the sea of disinformation that has been abounding. Anyway, I'm deciding to take that positive message out of our conversation, but it's been really great to have all of your inputs in this conversation. And I will just wrap it up there with a thanks to all of you for participating, and for all of you out there who are listening and who I can't see. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.
Thank you.